Thanks for tuning in today to Meet the Candidates 2018. Today our guest is Congressman Andy Barr. He's the incumbent, but he's also going to be the Republican candidate for 6th District House of Representatives. As a reminder to our folks out there, we're shooting this the last day of April, so it's just about 4 weeks out or so from Election Day. The primary election coming up on Tuesday, May 22nd. The winners of the Democratic-Republican primaries will face off in the general election, which is set for Tuesday, November 6th. Thanks again for coming by and visiting with us today. We appreciate it very much.
Great to be with you, John.
Great. Completing your third term?
That's right.
Been in there since 2000, I guess early 2013.
Right.
I looked it up. You're number 140, number 130 something, number 40 something, I guess, as far as seniority is concerned.
Really moved up pretty quickly.
Yeah, you have. Out of 435, that's getting there. So there might be a few viewers out here that really aren't familiar with Andy Barr. So let's just start there. Who's Andy Barr and why is he running for Congress?
Well, I was born and raised in central Kentucky in Lexington. All four of my grandparents were actually born in Lexington, Kentucky. Mm-hmm. I grew up there, graduated from Henry Clay High School, went away to college at the University of Virginia and came home to the University of Kentucky College of Law, practiced law. And then in 2010, decided to start a process of running for Congress and was ultimately elected in 2012. And I've had the great privilege and responsibility of representing the people of Central and Eastern Kentucky in the U.S. House of Representatives for the 6th Congressional District. Now in my third term, I am on the House Financial Services Committee. And earlier this term, my colleagues gave me the important responsibility of chairing the Subcommittee on Monetary Policy and Trade. A lot of people don't know exactly what that subcommittee does, but we have two basic functions. One is oversight over the Federal Reserve System. So we are trying to push for a more accountable, transparent, and conventional monetary policy so that interest rates are predictable for households and businesses. And then the second kind of function is even probably less well known, and that is our oversight over the Department of Treasury and its international operations, and in particular over the Treasury's implementation and enforcement of economic sanctions. So when you see North Korea in the news right now, mm-hmm. a considerable amount of our time and attention has been devoted to strengthening America's sanctions efforts against North Korea. That's paying dividends.
Well, I appreciate the feedback. It is actually one of my questions a little bit later, but I'll come back around to it if you don't mind. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about maybe not the three terms, but maybe more specifically the term that you're in or completing as we speak. What do you think are some of the more important accomplishments for the 6th District in the term that you're in today that you've been able to work on?
Well, I'd say three. The three biggest accomplishments are, number one, jobs in the economy. We now have a booming economy because of the pro-growth policies that we've put into place. So whereas we just came out of the slowest, weakest economic recovery since the Great Depression, slow growth, below 2% economic growth over the last decade, we're now moving into a phase of accelerated economic growth. 3 consecutive quarters of 3% growth on average. The Congressional Budget Office is now projecting that as a result of our pro-growth policies, we're moving into an era of 3 to 3.5% economic growth. I think this economy, with the right policies in place, could get to 4% growth. And that has major impacts for families. It has major impacts for businesses and their prosperity, because now unemployment is at a 42-year low in Kentucky. That's the lowest level of unemployment that we've seen since the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been reporting that number. Consumer confidence is at a 2-decade high. Small business optimism is at the highest level it's been in the history that the National Federation of Independent Business has been gauging that level of optimism. So it's the highest in history in terms of small businesses, Main Street businesses looking optimistically towards the future. It means that labor participation is growing. The number of able-bodied, work-capable adults, prime-age working people are moving into into the labor market, and wages are going up. Because there's tightening of the labor market, that means there's more competition for workers. And the Department of Labor earlier this year found that wage growth is the highest it's been since before the recession. So you're seeing really strong economic output. Why is that? Because of the deregulation program that we put into place, the fact that we've passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and we're on the precipice of achieving what we've been working on since the beginning of my time in Congress, and that is an off-ramp from the Dodd-Frank regulatory onslaught, the financial control law, that has really suffocated our community banks and denied access to credit and capital for farmers and homeowners and small businesses. And the real, epitome of this agenda, the capstone of this agenda, is the historic Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This was the first major overhaul of our tax code in 31 years. It will result in the average median income family in central Kentucky and in Franklin County seeing a lower tax bill over $2,000 on average. It means that our small businesses, for the first time in history, will get a 20% deduction on their pass-through income. And it means American companies are going to be more competitive in the global marketplaces. They'll be able to compete and win anywhere in the world. And as a result of the lower corporate tax rate, you're seeing 4 million plus Americans and counting receiving bonuses and increased wages and increased 401k contributions and extended parental leave benefits. And repatriated dollars from overseas is happening as a result. Billions of dollars coming back, earnings that were trapped overseas coming back, and companies relocating in the United States because of a new competitive tax code. So that's the first major accomplishment, is an economy that's moved from basically neutral into a highly accelerated growth phase that is inuring to the benefit of the American people and their prosperity. The second real issue that we've made progress on is this opioid addiction crisis. As you know, Kentucky suffers from the third highest opioid addiction mortality rate in the country. We have just a heartbreaking problem where so many of our fellow citizens are dying of overdoses. There's 115 people a day in this country that are dying of opioid overdoses. And so we've really focused on this issue because it's critical not only to these families that have these heartbreaking stories, but it's also important for our workforce. So many employers in central and eastern Kentucky tell me that they have trouble finding the workers. Now that we have growth, now that we've moved into a growth phase and jobs are being created, now they need to fill those positions with skilled workers. And so many employers tell me that they can't find people who can pass a drug test. So we've increased funding through the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, through the 21st Century Cures Act. Much of that money is coming to Frankfort and to our nonprofits that are working in prevention and treatment and recovery. We brought HUD Secretary Ben Carson to Lexington to look at some of our not-for-profit organizations, Recovery Kentucky and Revive and St. James Place and Shepherd's House, some of these organizations that are really providing great services for people who are struggling with addiction in terms of recovery. And I've introduced legislation that would help HUD, give HUD the flexibility, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the flexibility that Dr. Carson, Secretary Carson, who leads that agency, that he's requested, that would provide more funding for transitional housing in this area to help people move from addiction into a second chance and back into gainful employment and self-sufficiency and sobriety. And then finally, the third area where we've really made a difference is in national security. We've rebuilt the military. We've addressed the readiness crisis. We are moving back into a phase of air superiority. You know, we just came out of a year where there were more fatalities as a result of training accidents than in combat. And that's because we were not adequately resourcing our military. And so we're going to get back to an end strength that Secretary Mattis, our defense secretary, says we need to defend the country. And then our office has played a particularly important role in defending the country and keeping the American people safe, and that is on sanctions. Whether it's Russia, Iran, or North Korea, or other malign actors in the world, we are focusing our efforts on putting maximum economic pressure on our adversaries. And North Korea is a perfect example where sanctions are working. And I was able to author a bill called the Otto Warmbier North Korea Nuclear Sanctions Act. It passed the House 415-2 last October. That bill was named after Otto Warmbier, the American college student who graduated from my alma mater. Actually, never graduated. He went to my alma mater, the University of Virginia. And he was a student, went over to Pyongyang, to North Korea. He was arrested, he was tortured, and he was murdered by the regime there. So we named the bill in memory of him. And this bill, which passed the House, is the toughest economic sanctions ever directed at North Korea. And Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, told me personally that because of our efforts, because of this bill, that gave her more leverage at the UN Security Council with Russia and China to bring them to the table and put additional pressure, international pressure on Pyongyang. And you see what's happening now. You see that they're coming to the negotiating table, and we'll see what happens. But clearly, our efforts have made a difference.
It is a dynamic issue, and I hate to get too specific about it. Like I said, it's last day of April, and this plays back through May 22nd, and by then, maybe President Trump will have already met with North Korea face to face. Not sure how that's going to go, but how is that good for America? How is that good for Kentucky, and specifically Central Kentucky?
Well, it's very good for all of the United States because, as you know, North Korea has been developing under this failed strategic patience model of foreign policy from the previous several administrations. North Korea has gradually but surely developed a very potent nuclear program. And not only have they developed a nuclear program, they have developed the capability to deliver a nuclear device with their ballistic missile program. Strategic patience obviously failed. They most recently tested not only nuclear weapons that were many times more powerful than Hiroshima, but they've also tested intercontinental ballistic missiles. The one capability that they don't yet have is the reentry vehicle. But the fact that they can reach the continental United States and every part of the continental United States, Central Kentucky included, means that we've got to shift our policy to keep this country safe. There's a lot that's going on in addition to sanctions. Some of the military deterrence activities and the anti-missile defense work that's being done in the North Pacific. That's important as well to bring pressure on Pyongyang and the Kim regime. But clearly sanctions is a big part of that.
Has to be. Kim has just said in the last 3 or 4 days he's going to dismantle this whole nuclear program. I mean, time will tell. And like you said, the sanctions have, I guess, really played their part there.
And John, if I could just add, time will tell.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're coming to the negotiating table is not success. It's not success in and of itself. We've seen them in the past give overtures for giving up their nuclear program, and it hasn't happened. So a lot of work left to be done. And one other point I would make is verification is critical. One of the critical flaws of the Iran nuclear deal is that it did not give international inspectors access to military sites. Frankly, the sites where a nuclear program, illicit nuclear activity is most likely to take place. So to the extent Kim Jong-un commits to denuclearizing North Korea, the key is access, international inspectors, and verification.
Let's go back a little bit. You talked about opioid issue across the country, but I mean acute here in Kentucky, in Central Kentucky. What more can Congress do to help? I know that you've explained some things that have gone on here in just the last little bit, but what other things can they be doing to help us?
Frankly, I think they can do a lot more. We can do a lot more. Congress can do a lot more. We've done a lot of good things from the 21st Century Cures Act that provides block grants to states for treatment and for prevention and for law enforcement and Narcan and some of those other resources, emergency room resources. The Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act did some very good things. In fact, at the suggestion of the University of Kentucky, we were able to include an amendment into that bill that commissioned a federal study on best practices on how to deal with neonatal abstinence syndrome, this tragic situation where these kids are born addicted to opioids because their moms were abusing drugs during pregnancy. That's a rampant problem in central and eastern Kentucky. Now we have a federal study as a result of our work that provides hospitals, neonatal units, also pediatricians with the tools that they really need to best wean these babies off of addiction. So we're doing all these great things, but I did mention transitional housing, and I think this is a huge gap. What we've learned in talking to our nonprofits who are doing great work is they are under-resourced in transitional housing. So you can have a rehab or a detox facility that gets a person from jail or from overdose to a stable situation. But that may be a 30-day or 90-day process. At that point, sadly, what we see is many of those folks relapsing. Many of those folks going back to their same situation and falling prey to addiction once again. If we want long-term sustainable recovery, we need transitional housing that removes that person, that recovering addict, from the environment that got him into trouble in the first place. And that gives them the support services they need. So we've introduced a bill that would provide, that would specially purpose some Section 8 funding from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to be used with and in conjunction with work requirements, job training, addiction recovery programs like 12-step programs. In addition, drug testing to ensure that accountability. And the other part of this is sober living. So there's an accountable community that everybody holds each other accountable, and not just for 90 days, but for a year or 18 months or even 2 years. And we think that those programs, they're evidence-based, and those programs have proven to work. I mean, 70 to 80% improvement in terms of outcomes as a result of long-term sustained transitional housing. So if there's a gap, and I think that was your question, that's really where we need to focus our attention. That's why we brought Secretary Carson to Kentucky to not only show him programs that work, but to convince him that we need more resources in that area in particular.
I appreciate your information on that. Let's go back to touch on jobs for a little bit, and specifically, there was a lot of talk out there in the media when the president first announced some really pretty sweeping tariffs 8, 10, 12 weeks ago. There wasn't a lot of definition to what kind of tariffs we're talking about, but as information started trickling back to us here in Kentucky, in central Kentucky, there were industries here in this state that were pretty worried about some of the tariffs. In this community.
Absolutely.
So what's your take on, how some of the tariffs, have they been implemented? Are they going to be implemented? How broad they are, how narrowly scoped they are going to affect us here in the 6th?
Well, when the president announced the possibility of steel and aluminum tariffs and other tariffs, the vice president actually came to central Kentucky, to Woodford County, with me. And I had a chance to invite him to visit with many of the folks in the bourbon industry. Buffalo Trace right here in Franklin County is a big employer, important signature industry. We were able to get some big victories for the bourbon industry in the tax bill. A bill I introduced called the Aged Distilled Spirits Competitiveness Act, also a lowering of the excise tax. So we wanted to make sure we didn't erase those gains with tariffs that would result in retaliation. And we did see many folks like the European Union threatened to put a retaliatory tariff on our bourbon exports. Well, now's not the time to do that because we're experiencing a renaissance in bourbon, and those export markets are really vitally important to our industry. We did get a chance to facilitate a meeting between the Vice President and the Kentucky Distillers Association. I think the Vice President listened. And I've signed letters to the administration, to the U.S. Trade Representative, to the President, to his economic team, that if we're going to renegotiate these trade agreements like NAFTA, we need to make sure that we don't punish our allies where we have very healthy free trading arrangements. I'm all for improving free trade agreements, but let's not do any harm. And I think we've had results in that because, as you've seen, no tariffs have been put into place in the NAFTA negotiations, not yet at least, and none have been put into place with respect to Europe. The only tariffs that are under a comment period that will apply are directed towards China. And China really is the problem. Mm-hmm. China is stealing our intellectual property. China is abusing the trading system. Their mercantilist system is punishing our exporters, and yet we're not making any ground with China. So our enhanced relationships with our allies like Mexico and Canada through renegotiated NAFTA, our efforts with our European partners, and Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, was just with us earlier last week in Congress. Strengthening those trade relationships will put greater pressure on China. And, I've met with the president's top economic team, and Larry Kudlow reminded members of Congress who are free traders like myself and who care about exports of Camrys from Georgetown, exports of bourbon from Buffalo Trace and Woodford Reserve. He's reminded us that no tariffs have gone into place yet. And some of this, I think, is art of the deal. I think this president wants to mix things up. I think he wants to say we're no longer going to have unfair trade deals. And so I applaud the administration for wanting to get the best, fairest deal for the American people as he can, based on reciprocal trade. Free trade, but fair trade, reciprocal trade, and punish only those bad actors like China that is not engaged in free and fair and reciprocal trade.
Well, let's stick with jobs for a little bit. When the president, as he was running for office, the infrastructure bill was one of the things that he keyed on, and it hasn't really come to the forefront. There have been, a lot of other things going on, and it appears as the omnibus bill was, I guess, approved at the end of March, it's the last big piece of legislation for the remainder of this Congress, as it seems. So, is it going to be teed up in Congress come January? And if so, what pieces and parts do you see how that will impact Kentucky, specific to the infrastructure itself, or jobs, or what do you see as real needs in our area, in our community, in the infrastructure bill?
Well, you mentioned infrastructure, and I have to go back really quickly. We don't have. We will not have our potential as an economy unless we have a workforce infrastructure as well. And we were able to secure in the appropriations bill that you mentioned an amendment to increase funding by about $26 million for the high-intensity drug trafficking area program. That will give local law enforcement the ability to keep these poisons out of our communities, these opioids and heroin and fentanyl out of our communities, and that's going to directly benefit many of the counties in the 6th Congressional District, and that was an amendment that our office was able to secure as part of that appropriations bill. But in terms of roads and bridges and airports and water infrastructure and broadband infrastructure, we are making progress. That appropriations bill also included an increase in funding to the U.S. Department of Transportation for more surface infrastructure. We also, last week, we just came out of a reauthorization process for the Federal Aviation Administration. And the way I look at the president's infrastructure agenda, and this president is a builder. Remember, he's a builder. He wants to rebuild this country, and I think we need to for the sake of economic productivity. But it's a three-phase process. Aviation, so FAA, WRDA, which is the Water Resources Development Act, so water infrastructure, and the third piece is surface transportation, roads, bridges, interstates. So on the first piece, we passed a 5-year reauthorization. It goes to the Senate now. It's a major commitment to overhaul our air forces. The airport improvement program is dramatically increased, and we give general aviation airports much more flexibility. So that's piece number one. WRDA is coming up next. So ports, our water infrastructure, very, very critical, our locks and dams. And then finally, we're continuing to look forward to the Ways and Means Committee and the Transportation Committee making recommendations to the Congress on some financing mechanisms, whether that's modernization of existing revenue sources or new revenue sources for surface transportation. One thing that we definitely know we need to do, and which can help us finance roads and bridges, new roads and bridges, is is streamlining the permitting process. Some of the environmental permitting processes are outdated, antiquated, and overly bureaucratic, and they slow down the process and add billions of dollars to the cost of these projects. So part of the solution is streamlining the red tape associated with these projects and approving these projects quicker. Another piece is P3, public-private partnerships. And there is, as a member of the House Financial Services Committee, I can just tell you, there is pent-up demand to deploy capital, private capital, to support infrastructure. So with a little additional, and I say, 100 to $200 billion in additional public resources, we can leverage that up to $1 trillion, maybe $1.5 trillion with private capital. So there's a lot of opportunity to really rebuild the country and do so without overburdening the taxpayers.
Right. Well, this may be more of a statement than a question, but the $600 million that was put into this bill for broadband doesn't even scratch the surface on what it really needs to be. Yeah. You have one of the more rural districts that are off the highway, off the interstate highway, that lack. They have one provider in town, and there isn't effective competition. And those folks, to be 21st century employees, they need access to affordable and reliable broadband. And so I would, again, it's more of just a statement, but I would urge you to put $600 million doesn't go far with 350 million people in this country. We've just got a couple of minutes left.
I agree with you, by the way.
One of the things I think in our lifetime we probably talked more about, and I don't even know if we have enough time left to talk about it, but you're just going to have to be kind of short with me, is we've talked more about gun control measures over the course of the last 12 to 15 months than probably in our lifetime. What can Congress do better than what they've done today?
Well, as a father of 2 school children, this is something that I worry about and think about a lot, especially in light of Parkland and Sandy Hook and some of these other tragedies. And it's personal to me also because my good friend and colleague Steve Scalise was the victim of a crazed gunman on that baseball field less than a year ago. So we've got to do better than what we've done. Now, there is a narrative that Congress doesn't care or isn't doing anything, and that's false. We've passed the Stop School Violence Act as part of the appropriations bill. I signed a letter to regulate bump stocks. That's happened. The Stop School Violence Act is grants to school districts to provide for metal detectors and better communication with law enforcement and providing additional resources for parents, teachers, and kids to identify aberrant behavior and help intervene ahead of time. And there's other measures that we can take too, such as just some basic things that are constitutional, ways to keep our kids safe and our families safe, including looking at the gun violence restraining order idea, which protects the Second Amendment for law-abiding people. But, in the case of Parkland, the FBI totally missed it. And so they say, if you see something, say something. Well, in that case, people saw something, they said something, and nothing happened. And so I think we've got to take a serious look at restraining orders for people who are with due process, but who demonstrate their willingness to commit a crime with weapons. I think we all agree, even those of us who are strong supporters of the Second Amendment, that someone who is seriously mentally ill or someone who has demonstrated a willingness to carry out a terrible crime, that person should not have access to weapons. And we also fixed the NICS system. We included in that appropriations bill a response to that Sutherland Springs church shooting. Everybody talks about checks. Well, we need checks, but if you don't have the information in the background check system, it does no good. We passed a bill to better populate the NICS system, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, with more relevant information so that when that check happens, it actually is meaningful and can help stop the sale of a weapon to a mentally disturbed person. So the narrative that Congress is not doing something is totally false. We can do more, we can do better, but this is an important issue and we are taking action.
I appreciate it. We have run out of time. Congressman, I appreciate you coming by and visiting with us. Thanks for giving us a couple of minutes of your time. Good luck. As a reminder, Tuesday, May 22nd, get out there and vote. Tune in 6 o'clock that night on FPB TV for election returns from the county clerk's office. Thanks for tuning in.